we in? Are we in? Are we in? Paul?
I think so.
Just rounding up the stragglers. Okay. Alright, lock the doors. Well, good evening everybody, and thank you very much for turning up. I think this is probably the biggest turnout we've had for quite a while. I've got an alter ego. I'm the secretary of the branch here, but we had a speaker drop out, so I've done this presentation a few times before. This is freshly polished just for you, so I hope you enjoy it. It's, if you want to ask questions during, that's fine by me. Hopefully it'll be a bit of fun. I'm going to try and show you a few things that are, in my opinion, pathologically stupid. But first, I'm going to say some thank yous. So we've got a bit of an agenda. I'm going to say some thank yous. Last month we had a talk from Dave Stubley from 7 Elements over in Lithgow, and he gave a very good and powerful explanation of how people get taken, and he explained how somebody lost $500,000 worth of Bitcoin through a transaction. So he was very good. And last week I was at the National Museum of Computing. Unfortunately, I've forgotten Sheridan's second name, but he reminded me just how old an 80-column punch card is, and it was a really, really good talk. And I'm going to finish with the National Museum of Computing. So in between, cyber security. Why is it so important? Well, lots of people are hearing about GDPR, but if you don't know what it is, then it's time you did. And if you're running a business, it's much too late, because it's coming into force in a few weeks' time. I've got a few very far from subliminal messages in the presentation, and it's all about security. There is no ROI. If you want security in your IoT devices and you've already deployed them, it's a bit late. GDPR will hurt. The BCS were very much aware of this when they briefed branch members at a conference a year before last. And when we circulate the sign-in sheet that Stuart's got at the minute, we're very careful with what we do with your email addresses, because that's counted as private personal data. You probably know about TalkTalk and how much information they lost. If you lose the kind of stuff that TalkTalk lost, the fines are potentially crippling. So it's starting to concentrate minds at long last. So a couple of interesting anecdotes, because Dave Stubley made me a little bit more aware about the kinds of things that go on when you get these phishing phone calls. And I got a text message half an hour before I tried to use my credit card. Of course I tried to use my credit card because I didn't see it on the phone, and it got blocked. Why? So why did Visa decide to stop my card? So somewhere something has picked up my card details. And then I got a phone call from my mobile phone provider, and the questioning was going, well, what's this, you know, the usual kind of security. And it just shows how aware you have to be when you're having a telephone conversation. It just reminded me. I thought it was worthwhile mentioning them. And you will be getting an email from the BCS in Edinburgh. But I had one, I think this first one a couple of days ago, asking me to verify my email preferences, because one of the things that GDPR asks is that everybody explicitly needs your permission to share your details. And in the past, it's just been a little tick box at the bottom. And it's always ticked by default unless you untick it. So that's one of the important things, one of the messages I wanted to get over tonight. So, Internet of Things, connected everything. There are lots of useful things, and there are quite a lot of not so useful things. I've spoken about quite a few of these before. So, what is a thing? So, I'm going to cover all of these in a little bit of detail tonight. Some are more recent than others. So, the internet is about connected sensors, but an unconnected sensor has absolutely no value. These smartphone devices, they're packed with sensors. So, smartphones, I've got Fitbit in my pocket, smartwatch, got one of those too. They're only smart if they've got connectivity. And there are an awful lot of toys, both adult and kids, that leak data for whatever reason. And it's invariably because the design of the software stack that's on them is inadequate, and the amount of product and software assurance is just simply not there. So these are useful things. I took these pictures yesterday, or might be Monday, and they're flood sensors, and this is from a website called GaugeMap, and they're really quite handy. because you can get Twitter alerts. So if you live near the Water of Leith, there's a couple of sensors on the Water of Leith, and you can see the water levels rising. And so there are some very, very good things about Internet of Things, and there are some very useful things you can do. I come from an industrial control background. My first 5 years in IT was industrial control and supervisory control. So I've always been interested in this kind of stuff. So bovine step counters, they're quite useful because you can tell by the way a cow steps when it's about to enter estrus and then when you actually artificially inseminate it. So let's try that, thank you. So these things, if you can find a way of crowdsourcing the accelerometer data from these anonymously, you can find potholes, which I think is quite relevant at the minute, judging by the number of potholes that are about. So why should you worry about security when it's an internet thing? Well, if it's very high value and it's going to be there for a long time and it's performing some proper function like industrial control, then it matters. It matters a lot that you can actually do something meaningful with it and update it over an extended period of time. But if it's a £3 Amazon button, then probably not. So I'm hoping there's quite a lot of software developers in the room tonight, and especially the startups in Edinburgh. If you don't put security in at the beginning and you're trying to reverse engineer it, it's too late. It's actually a really good idea once you've got your framework for your software laid out to actually get somebody else to come and have a look at it and do a bit what we used to call a peer review when we used to do code walkthroughs, which was always a good bit of fun. But at least you used to trap the obvious errors. And the obvious errors are really scary ones because most of the products on the marketplace that have been exploited have got glaring security loopholes in them. I'm going to talk about 3/4 of the way. I'm going to cover applying software updates and doing things like that because there are some frameworks that are useful. So from an IoT perspective, there's a list of attack vectors here, which I'm going to cover more or less in order, hopefully. So networks, and that's just an excuse really to put this photograph of the old man's store up. But when Vodafone say they've got 99% population coverage, that doesn't mean you're going to get signal somewhere because they forget how big Scotland is and how much empty space there is in the northwest. So if you get a signal, you're lucky. Hopefully with BE getting a 4G contract for emergency services, the coverage will improve. But I live next to a main road and we haven't got 4G coverage. But from an industrial perspective, you've got to have a network of some description. So I reclassified these. Somebody like me is a bit long in the tooth will remember the term metropolitan area network, but I chose these because these are kind of metropolitan. LwM is a really nice grid, and that's being deployed in quite a lot of places if you follow the Twitter feeds. The ones that are a bit more home or office, that's the unlicensed frequency for using little remote on and off. I've got one of those, it's absolutely brilliant. Some of the ones that are more common in IoT in domestic situations are a Bluetooth or Zigbee or Z-Wave. Passive Wi-Fi is something else that's coming along. So those are some networks. Obviously there's no cable, but that's my favourite because that's a lot harder to snoop. And if that's connected to a switch, it's not shared. So if you've got a Wi-Fi network, you're sharing the bandwidth with everything else in your house. And the latency on a Wi-Fi network, if you're doing something like a backup, is absolutely woeful. So if you want high performance backups, you need one of those. It's also a lot harder to snoop. And I'm going to cover some of the weaknesses in products that are on the market when they don't use one of those. So I like that one, I always have done. This is the first example. Hotel control system. It wasn't me that went there, but it had Android tablet devices for controlling the lights. It was connected up with an RJ45, but there was no physical security on the port whatsoever. And the guy just unplugged it, plugged his laptop in, did a bit of sniffing, worked out that it was Modbus over TCP, and was having such great fun because he worked out all the IP addressing and he was be able to turn off somebody else's lights. But it really, on another room, on another floor, and it's crazy. Really pathologically stupid not to fix as simple as gluing the port in would have been enough. But no, it just had a bit of fun. So, this kettle, and yes, there's kettles and toasters in this presentation, but I'm sorry, I'm not coming around with hot drinks. This this particular incarnation, you can't change the default device password if you've got an Android device, but you can if you've got iOS, which is a bit bizarre. But if you want to see a bit more of that, when the slides go up online, all of these are hyperlinks. And then there's this one. That came out last week, just to show that this is a presentation that's about as current as it possibly can be. It's only a matter of time before somebody works out a way of burning your toast remotely. But the problem is that the proliferation of devices simply means there's an even bigger attack vector if you've got in. And there are ways of getting in. I'm going to cover those shortly. So, some offices that are very serious about security use 802.1x. That's a way of stopping it. Wireless just is open. Used to be a means of, people used to war drive around and borrow people's Wi-Fi bandwidth when it was a lot harder to get hold of. But there's more important things nowadays in terms of what you can do and what you can infer when people are logging on. If you hooked into somebody's Wi-Fi network and somebody's logging onto a website and it's HTTP, then they've not only worked out what one of your email addresses is and what your password is, but they can use that as a basis for trying to break into your bank account or or your Amazon account or anything. So it's really quite important. Now, about 2.5 years ago, I actually had a car stolen. And if it had a crook lock on it, it wouldn't have gone walkies. But my boss didn't like the £25,000 bill he got for the unexpired part of the lease. And my car's parked out in George Square and it does have a crook lock on it. So this has happened a lot in London, blocking the blipper on the remote locking. And I'm going to come on to something else in the same vein at the minute. So all the examples I've talked about, kettles, and come on to some more as well, they're just lack of sensible engineering, sound engineering. But worse, people buy devices and they never change the user IDs, they never change the passwords. If you put your router on the windowsill and the access codes are usefully on the little card on the back, and it's on the windowsill, people could just look through your window and read them off. So you really do need to be just a little bit smart. So last week, GitHub had a big DDoS, and it was using insecure open database services that are on the web. And there was one yesterday, and it was even bigger than that one. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But if you take the simple precautions, like burglars, they go somewhere else. If you just put up enough hurdles, they go somewhere else. And they look for somebody else with less security than you have. A friend of mine, when he got his first ADSL router, and he put a firewall on the end of it, within 5 minutes of it coming online, he was getting peppered by people probing his external IP address. This happens all the time. If you look in your router logs, this is what happens. And the most important thing is that a lot of them are looking for the plug and play port that's usually default open, inbound. And that's how one of the other exploits I'm going to talk about later was done. That's how they found them. So, there's a world of possibilities. Anybody recognise this? It's the Google car. It's a bit ugly, but hey ho. You have to start somewhere. So I'm now going to talk about some real hacks on motor cars. Chrysler put a recall out for this Jeep because they could get into it and use the internet connected entertainment system and apply the brakes remotely. And then the Outlander had the Wi-Fi in the hotspot in the car. They could actually turn the alarm off. So it's a great way of losing a 40 grand car in no time at all. So this TV, I quite like that. The reason I chose this picture is because it just doesn't fit in the trolley. Made me smile. So they sit and listen. I've got an Android TV, a Sony one, and that listens, but I've turned it off. So this is a great. I'm sure some of you have got one of these devices in your home somewhere. But you really need to turn make the privacy settings on so it actually forgets your conversations afterwards. I'm going to come to that again later. So, it's not just denial of service. Sometimes it can actually be either life-threatening or business-threatening. So this insulin pump used an unencrypted link between the pump and the metering controller, and you could you could make somebody overdose, which is fatal. And somebody found that there were some issues with the pacemaker device, and the knowledge of that information was used to short sell the stock of the shares before the vulnerability was actually disclosed. So it's a matter of life and death sometimes, and if you're doing industrial control and you haven't got the right security in, somebody could be turning pumps on or electricity off, and these kind of things have happened. Not here, but certainly in the States. So, if at all possible, the sensible precautions, metal cabinets, secured connections. It's worth checking your ISP router and having a look and having a sniff. It's really easy to do if you've got a Raspberry Pi at home. You can see quite easily what's floating around on your network and whether or not it's your data coming from where you'd expect it to be or from outside. So I was reading last week, I knew about the encryption key problem with the smart meters that they're putting in. What I didn't realise was that they were Wi-Fi only, which is priceless. So you can't connect it to a physical network. So as I said, there's some takeaways here. You can, if you can read the unencrypted, if you can determine where those meter readings are coming from, and it's not that hard, people can work out whether you're in or out. They can work out whether or not to break in or not, so it's quite important. So, as of, while I was on holiday last week, I was picking up some other new stuff. So if you've got an Android phone, this is a new one. Curation on Android apps isn't quite as robust as perhaps it could be. And I don't know if you've ever seen a piece of software called WebUSB that's a plug-in for Chrome, which means you can actually make your USB device accessible over the internet. But unfortunately, this key here, which is supposed to be unfishable, WebUSB makes it fishable, which is a bit of a tragedy. So if you've implemented two-factor authentication in one of these, you're potentially in trouble. WebUSB is a bit dangerous. And I've not covered that. There's no mention of those. For the vast majority of IoT devices, it probably doesn't matter. But right at the minute, from an overall risk perspective, the risk of these is pretty low, even though it's getting lots and lots of attention in the media. The reason it's pretty low is because it's actually quite hard to achieve. But that may change in time, because things do change. I was talking to a young man in the audience before we started, and he's done quite a lot of MBA. You've got a master's, haven't you? Yeah, he's got a master's in cyber security. This stuff's really, really, really important. And right at the minute, that's hard, but it won't be hard forever. And Dave Stubley put a very nice diagram up, inverted diagram of lots of people, script kiddies at the top and the professionals at the bottom. And when the tools leak out, they start at the bottom and they permeate up the community that do this for fun, which is a bit of a shame. So as I was finishing this slide off last night, I got to this, which is a bit scary. So it's 1.7 terabits. I get the T in, didn't I, yesterday? And this is because these database systems are just sitting there on the internet, and they've got absolutely no authentication whatsoever. But if you send them spoofed packets with somebody else's IP address in, when it responds to the IP address of the target you're trying to run a DDoS on, which is pretty frightening. I'm sorry, I am losing my voice a little bit. So, this security camera was used in one of the older DDoS attacks. The board inside it is actually in about 75 different manufacturers of security cameras. I've got a link at the bottom of the presentation that explains a lot more about it. It was got quite deep, but basically that's got a root account on it, not protected by a password at all. It's quite difficult to actually stop if you're using these devices for for their proper purpose. If they're not behind a firewall, and they're only behind your standard home router device that's got UPnP enabled on it, they can be used to send. They can be used to send. That's better. They can be used to run these DDoS attacks. So it's quite important. So some takeaways here. It's only a matter of time, because people put this stuff and they just forget about it. Whether it's your Blu-ray player, your PVR recorder, all of mine are connected to the network. But they've all got firmware on, they've all got software on of some description. The reason I mention trusted hardware is one of my colleagues said at one of the sessions, have you ever seen an IoT device with trusted hardware? And the answer was no, I haven't. But they really need to be upgradable over the air. And I don't know if some of you have probably played with these ESP 286, 8266 devices, these tiny little ones you can even do over the air with updates with those. So there's really no excuse for not being able to do some updates later. I'm going to talk a little about home automation, because that's where most of this stuff, most of the public interest in these technologies is in home automation. And there's lots, and that's where quite a few of them come in. So, this is a wireless doorbell. You fasten it to the front of your house, you configure it, fasten it to the front of your house. You can take the front off, take the front off, you don't need any tools. You press a button, and it'll expose your Wi-Fi security key, which is rather nice of them. So, as I said earlier, it's not about borrowing Wi-Fi bandwidth, it's about being able to do some, join onto your Wi-Fi network and watch what you're doing. Which is why there's been a big push to make websites run HTTPS. And even if you've got an unsigned certificate and it's something internal inside, some device internal, it's better to have an unsigned certificate than no certificate. It putting a hurdle in front of somebody who's trying to do nasty things to you that could be expensive. So we've all heard about the Alexa problem, I want a doll's house, which then gets repeated over the TV, and all of a sudden other people are automatically getting doll's houses delivered because they've got automatic payments set up on Amazon. Which begged the question, why did my credit card details finish up in me getting my card blocked half an hour before I wanted to use it? Even if I was only going to validate the room for 2 days. It was just inconvenient and annoying. So I did check. The main thing you need to do if you've got an Alexa is set the settings so that the history of conversations is purged, and if you turned off Facebook facial recognition. Because these things are always set on by default unless you turn them off. So it's always worthwhile just being aware, because if you're Facebook or Amazon, you're the product, they're interested in selling stuff to you. So it's really important that you actually make life as difficult for them as possible. And in fact, after reading that Facebook had this little habit of putting a completely invisible, very tiny object on a web page that had got nothing to do with them, and then using it to track you, even though you've got tracking turned off. When I run a browser called Firefox, some of you may be aware of it, and it's got a tool in it called NoScript. So Facebook, NoScript blocks, will not run JavaScript or any other form of code. So that's a way of, so if you run Chrome, I'm sure there are things in Chrome or Vivaldi that do the same thing. And it's a real pain in the neck when you visit a website you actually want to visit for the first time, because you get a list of blocked sites. But it's worthwhile in the long run because you can actually turn that off, so they can't track you if you don't want them to. So, have you done those? And that's, a bit of a reminder. How many sites have you stored your payment details in? Maybe involuntarily, or something you've just done and forgotten. Now, it's not so bad when a card ages out and it's no longer valid. But I'm certainly very much aware of it because Dave Stubley just reminded us how important it was to keep on top of how you pay for things, where these things are, and how easy it is to socially engineer stuff out. Because if they break into your account, your Amazon account, they can be just add a new delivery address, and they're away. So, from the point of view of IoT, standards are coming. It's taking quite a long time. You can see some of the dates on here. 2014. A colleague of mine got me these because he was working with the government on some of this stuff. So thank you, Nick, if he's watching. This one's quite amusing. This thing is, this is an RJ45 socket, so it's really tiny. Looks like an ordinary RJ45 socket, doesn't it? It's not. It's got a web server built into it, which is pretty cool if you're trying to do something wicked and really tiny. But how do you fix the security? I don't know what version. I don't know whether you're running Apache or not, but Apache's called Apache for a reason. So, who's going to patch it? The vendor? You? Bear in mind that safety critical recalls for cars never achieve 100%. Now I know that the mobile providers did something about Note 7, but Tesla very carefully updated some of the software to fix on their motor cars to fix a security bug. And of course, cars these days are absolutely chock full of electronics. Everything they do is controlled by electronics. So it's really important that somebody takes ownership of. I thought there was a fly in at the bottom of that. It is quite feasible to build your own IoT devices, and if you're building your own IoT devices, not so sure about the micro bit, but Raspberry Pis, or this little device here, that's an inch square, that's called a VOCore, it's about that big. You can run OpenWRT on it, and it's got multiple Ethernet interfaces in it, so while it's a bit tricky, you can actually do some quite useful things with that, because OpenWRT turns very nicely into a firewall. But there is quite a lot in the Raspberry Pi magazine, because Mozilla have launched something called Project Things, and it uses IoT, the Pi as a gateway to some of the networking technologies that I mentioned earlier. And you can make it an integration hub for HomeKit and Google and Alexa. And this API has gone to W3C, and if you know what W3C is good. So that's an open standard when the W3C ratify it. So it's quite feasible to build this stuff yourself if you're interested. You can, of course, on a device that's running Debian, you can actually enable IP tables, and you can turn off. Firstly, you can turn off all the services you know you're not going to use, and secondly, you can actually track and control what's going in and out at a different level as well. So it's quite feasible. We use Ansible at work because it's a really powerful tool for controlling builds on, especially on Unix devices, but it works perfectly well on Windows as well. And just connect over an SSH tunnel, and you run commands remotely. Now if I build a Raspberry Pi, there's a whole bunch of software I always put on it, and I use this to do it because it's quicker than remembering to go add this library, add this authentication key, and all this stuff. So I use Ansible for that. Although I'm not going to bring this the registered IoT viewpoint, it was quite amusing. You see the dates, you can see how long I've been talking about this kind of stuff. There are so many different hubs, there are dozens and dozens and dozens on the internet for doing IoT integration. But not all of these hubs will survive. There's a link to Dr. Joseph Rager is a fellow. Now I'm a Fujitsu distinguished engineer, so from a distinguished engineering perspective, he's my boss. And he's very, very knowledgeable, and he's just written a blog post about that. Because some of these will disappear. So if you've built your IoT integration on a hub that vanishes, you're in trouble. So I wrote this, I borrowed some of this, and I've written some of this quite a lot because I've done microcode development on microprocessors in my past life. So there's a list of things, the kinds of things you really want to be able to do with these. Bootstrapping and key management and so on. Quite a lot of things to think about. Fortunately, there are working groups and standards bodies that have done the thinking for you, and I'm going to come to that in a few moments and see how we're going for time. So there's an Underwriters Labs document talking about certifications for IoT devices. The problem is that if you want to read it, it's $800, which is a bit unfair. There are lots of IoT devices. As I said earlier, that if you stand around long enough, the market takes over. And I was doing networking when OSI was the flavour of the month, and it was going to be the thing in networking, and it never happened because everybody started implementing TCP/IP. So OSI just never really happened. But a lot of companies spent an awful lot of money and lost their shirt on it when it just really didn't take off. So as I was saying, the consortia are very useful for who have been, because they're developing usable standards. And I actually did an IoT workshop here run by one of them about 18 months ago, which was very interesting. So, the one I went to was Open Mobile Alliance, OMA, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about their stack in a moment. In my opinion, and opinion a lot of open is good. If you can read the source code, you can have a pretty good idea whether it's safe or not. And if you want to do this yourself, you can do this with Raspberry Pis and devices like that and MQTT. It's really easy, really straightforward. There are so many guides on the internet for doing this stuff and passing JSON messages around. It's just really straightforward. So this is the architecture that the Open Mobile Alliance developed, and this runs on an ARM chip. Now, the ARM chip in a Raspberry Pi is not vulnerable to spectrum meltdown because it doesn't have the look-forward features that are in the big Intel chips and the AMD chips. The more advanced ARM chips that are in devices like this, they are potentially vulnerable. But again, it's quite hard, especially when they've got the amount of security on it. So the workshop that I did actually involved taking an ARM development board and deploying code to it and putting the certificates on it so you could actually verify that the code that you were downloading to it and you'd authenticated the device. So it was end to end. You knew what that device was, you knew what code was on it. But it's very interesting. And the point about that is that it's all on GitHub. So you don't have to roll your own. You can actually go and use the code that people and this framework, because that's the back end, and these are machine-to-machine applications, and down the bottom. So this is a real how-to of how to deliver this stuff in a practical, secure way, an industry-standard approach. Unfortunately, it's full of acronyms, most networking stuff. So UDP, of course, is just fire and forget, like a postcard, rather than a session-oriented conversation like TCP. And obviously TLS will be transport layer security, and it uses COPE rather than SOAP, and COPE is constrained application protocol, so it's got a very limited functionality set. I thought you might find out at least some sensible guidance. There is some stuff out there, and it's progressed a lot in the 18 months since I went on the module. So we're actually doing quite well for time because nobody's asked any questions yet. So I've got some guidance for you. If you can control your lights, and one of the pictures I put right at the beginning was the Philips Hue. The Philips Hue authentication and all of its configuration stuff is all completely open. There's no encryption. There's absolutely zip, nada. So it's quite easy to turn somebody else's lights on and off, or change the colour. There are lots and lots and lots of vendors competing in this marketplace. So you either pick one and stick with it, or choose a framework. I happen to mention HomeKit here because I tried doing HomeKit on a Raspberry Pi, and behold, it works. So they're all different. That's the challenge. You're responsible for keeping it all up to date, because if you've got half a dozen devices and they all need to work, and from different vendors, you can get into a right upgrade mess. Now, Sony have managed to break my 4K TV from the soundbar because the soundbar doesn't recognise when the TV's turned on, and they're both bizarre. But if you've got an Android phone, you're locked into this. When am I going to get an update for your device? And it's because it falls down between the gap of the device manufacturer who's just got it out the door because they only want to sell devices, and the service provider, or the network provider. So it's quite a challenge. So from a software development perspective, you get security by starting at the beginning. If you start at the end, it's just too late. If you're choosing products, choose them with care. Choose one. Choose something and stick with it. Because the wider spread of devices you've got, the more attack vectors there are, and therefore the easier it is potentially to break in. Now, most people aren't interested in what you're doing, but they're interested in exploiting the capabilities of your device to do damage to somebody else. But it is important from a personal perspective that you don't really want to be leaking personal data, especially under GDPR, so there will be big fines floating around, because GDPR has got teeth, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with Brexit. It hasn't, because they've already said they're going to implement it regardless. So, some things you can do. Disable plug and play in WPS on your router or access points, because it punches holes through your firewall. If your cameras aren't behind a firewall, then you should consider taking them, putting them on a separate network maybe. Back to Dave Stubley, two-factor authentication. It's really important. Trusted devices and Google Authenticator can get you a long way. So there's another link there to I think that's another register page. It's well worth a read. This is all about awareness in the first place. If you know it's possible, then you can in your back end, but it's so easy to get caught, like I say, with this phone call from EE. Thank you very much. You're not trying to sell me something, but it spooked me about half an hour afterwards when I thought about it. Yes, I would be a bit more careful. And so there's a few more recommendations. If you've got a mobile phone, don't root it, because what you're doing is in order to root it, to put some software on that you might find useful, what you're actually doing is stripping all the manufacturer security off first. So the number that came from EE was from Watford. I don't get phone calls from Watford. In fact, they're down in my bag, but my contactless cards are in a metalised foil envelope, because if somebody walks past your handbag or your trouser pocket and that's where your cards are, they can take 20 quid off or 30 quid off and you won't even know. And they only need an aerial about that big. They just walk past, gone. If you've got a device that's got a contactless payment system, and I know Android have got because Google Pay, but that's a lot more secure because you can't unlock it. It will not pay anybody unless you've unlocked it with your fingerprint or your face. This is too old to have facial recognition. But if you've got keyless unlocking, which means it unlocks as you walk up to it, I've seen a video of two guys standing outside somebody's house. One guy's standing near to the key, and he's got a repeater for the signal that's coming off the key, and there's another guy standing next to the car. And miraculously, the car unlocks, they can start it, and they can drive it away, and it's gone. Now, whether they did that with mine's on keyless, but how they got into it, I don't know. But I've seen a video on that. It was a white Mercedes coupe. History. Yes, crook locks. Not that everybody who had an old Escort would know how easy it was to unlock because you just use a mini key, an old mini, proper mini. So that's why people like crook locks. So that's the ultimate. Who do you trust? Who do I trust? Well, as fewest number of people as possible. There's the bottom line. So here's a quiz, because tomorrow is International Women's Day, and I'm absolutely delighted to see we've got, in comparison, we normally have about 25 people here, and there may be 1 or 2 women. So it's not a quiz, but you all know that that's Ada Lovelace. Did you know the next one is Mavis Beatty? Code breaker, Bletchley Park. One of my most favourite places in the world, Bletchley Park. This stuff's only working because of Hedy Lamar's Wi-Fi spread spectrum patent that was used for directing torpedoes, I think, from recollection. I love this photograph. When we used to print out code, the code is taller than Margaret Hamilton. She wrote code for Apollo. And I'm just the right age to remember Apollo, and it was so exciting. Next one, and I've got a crib sheet here just in case I forget, because I'm getting on a bit. This is Susan Kerr. She designed the icons for the original Apple Mac. The lady on the left, Dr. Helen Sharman, first Brit in space. Some of you will recognise this lady here, Sue Black, founder of BCS Women, author of Saving Bletchley Park. A great read. If you haven't read it, read it, because it explains how she used social media to drum up support to save Bletchley Park from falling into the dust. And if you've never been there, please go. The next one is Claire Williams. She runs Williams Grand Prix Engineering, a more macho sport I cannot think of, but she holds her own on merit, not just because she's the son of Frank Williams. She's the daughter, sorry. I told you you'd get a laugh. Grace Hopper, Admiral Grace Hopper, software developer. The last two, I'm not expecting anybody to know, because this lady here is Regina Moran. She works for Fujitsu, she's from Ireland. And the last one is Dr. Nikki Fox. I've known Nikki since she was 18. She's the lead project scientist on the solar mission, the Parker solar mission to the sun. And she just happens to be my daughter's godmother, but she's based in Washington, Maryland. So, on International Women's Day, we should celebrate everybody who's an engineer, every woman who's an engineer, because we need more. We are wasting far too much talent, because 9% is just not enough. And finally, got some questions. There's a reconstructed Turing bomb. They built it from scratch, and it's presently in the National Museum in Bletchley Park. But the trust that built it and Bletchley Park have decided that they're going to rehome it to the National Museum of Computing, which is where I was last Monday, avoiding all the snow up here. And they're trying to raise 50 grand. They're about halfway there. And another tenner won't do any harm. But thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed my diatribe on looking after your personal security. More than happy to take any questions that you can conjure up.
I saw an advertisement from eMobile that still exists over in Europe, and they were, they had a group of people that were trying to get money to develop a VPN. Hopefully you'd buy it and sign up with eMobile's VPN service to hook your home devices to the VPN. It's a little, looks like little
gizmo.
Yeah. Have you? I just saw the advert and almost, you know, signed up to to get a first generation product.
You can do that with a Raspberry Pi so much simpler,
so.
so much more simpler.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, and then you're in control of the patch updates and things like that.
Have you ever seen one or?
I actually got about halfway through setting up OpenVPN on a Raspberry Pi, and then I got distracted and I forgot the password, so I'm going to have to start from scratch. But so much of this, there is so much of this stuff on the internet. Guides on setting up MQTT, which is witheringly easy. If you can so the best language to learn, one of the languages I teach as a STEM ambassador is Python. And Python is a fabulous programming language. First programming language I learned was COBOL, after BASIC. Yeah, Python is really, really good fun. And you can even get an image of the Raspberry Pi operating system, and you can put it on a DVD or a CD, and you can live boot your laptop off it. And because that's the operating system that kids are seeing a lot in school, being able to put that in front of children is absolutely fabulous if you're doing a code club or something like that, because it's something they're already familiar with. You just download it off the Raspberry Pi website. I'm running a VM on here, a virtual machine with Pixel 86 on it. But yeah, you can. If you want to effectively connect back to home with a VPN, there are tools you can do, and you don't need to buy something to do it. And you can have control over how much power it uses, and you can make it do a lot of other things because it's barely breaking sweat. Running encryption is one of the more challenging things. Where it used to be, it used to be that you'd have SSL offload, because running SSL, HTTPS, takes roughly 10 times more compute than a straight HTTP session. But power of computers just keeps going up and up and up, or has done. It might slow down a bit now after Meltdown and Spectre, but essentially more than enough compute power, especially for £4.
Are Fitbit still broadcasting wide open, do you know?
Quite possibly. You could try and find mine if you like. Except the battery's flat, I think, nearly. Quite possibly. Of course, they are one of the... There's not much you can do with it, to be honest. In that it's only got a Bluetooth... Yeah, Bluetooth's one of those moderately safe things, because there's not that much you can do to the Fitbit. You might break it, but the net loss is fairly minimal. But if you've broken into somebody's own control system and you know when they're in, when they're out, you can decide. Somebody who wants to could decide knowing when they're out, whether or not to open the back door without being invited. So yeah, I mean, you can see it certainly pops up on both my mobile phones, but I'm only running the app on the one. But the battery life's a bit rubbish at the minute because they've changed the software. Any more? Have I blinded you all with science? I hope not. That wasn't the objective. It's fascinating. I have to say, I've been involved in industrial control systems since 1980, and the first one I did was a paint shop, painting a motor car. And they're fascinating because it's right at the pointy end of making things, and it concentrates the mind when something goes wrong, and you've got 15 minutes to fix it before they start making cars. And they start yelling. It's quite relaxed in comparison, but not being at the production coalface. But I certainly found it very interesting. I've been very lucky. I've had a long career doing what I love, and that's what I say to people in my STEM events. I do something that I really enjoy. I have a passion for. And I got a letter from a retirement provider the other day, and I thought, hang on a minute, I've got no intention of retiring just yet. Well, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate the fantastic turnout. Really, really great.